we've been listening to Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland address the detainment of former diplomat Michael Kovrig. The CBC's Evan Dyer is here with me to discuss what we just heard. You were part of that technical briefing earlier today, Evan. The minister covered a lot of ground there. I do want to highlight something very interesting that came up, which is the prospect, I think we should say, that a second Canadian finds themselves in a difficult situation. She referenced somebody who had reached out to Foreign Affairs. They haven't been able to contact that individual. So a lot of questions around what that might mean. No specific suggestion that this individual is being detained, but a lot of other ground there too. What stood out for you?
Well, on that issue of the second potential detainee, I'm interested to learn more about how that person was able to contact Canadian authorities. That sort of suggests they're not in the same kind of incommunicado detention, at least at that point when they made that contact. She said that they were concerned about the questions they were being asked. Yes. Does that mean they had not yet been arrested and sort of swept away? So I'm very curious to hear about that person's situation. It sounds slightly different from Michael Kovrig's. She also made a point of the Attorney General having a veto after the judicial process is over, and then went on to make that very interesting comment about our extradition partner. It's not only about China. We also hope that our extradition partner will use the extradition process in ways to, I think she said, to further justice and the rule of law. Why would you say that? Well, obviously because the leader of our extradition partner, President Donald J. Trump, has been out there suggesting that he might want to use Meng Wanzhou as a bargaining chip in his trade talks with China, which completely undermines the rule of law arguments that Canada has made. And of course, even if we follow due process in this country and then return her under that existing extradition treaty to the United States, and the United States were to use her in that way, I'm not saying it would, this may just be President Trump talking, and Canadian officials have been careful to distinguish between his words and the independent judiciary that exists in the United States still. But if that were to happen, then that would completely undermine everything that Canada does to try to appear above board.
Yeah, we're going to drill down on that question of Donald Trump's comments, the extradition process with an expert in just a moment. But I also want to talk about the question of travel advisories. That's something the minister was asked about today. What did you make of that?
Well, certainly they're leaving leaving it very open for it to be changed. Right now, there's 4 levels. It's at the second level. Exercise a high degree of caution, I think, is the standard short form. The next one after that is avoid non-essential travel. If indeed another Canadian has been picked up, if it's a person who is perhaps an executive, because that would be a kind of a tit-for-tat role when you look at the person who's being held in Canada, one might expect to see that warning raised. But raising it preemptively, of course, is another escalation with China, and Canada may be keen not to go that way. But yeah, I think we have to watch, and if we see more arrests, I would be expecting that, as in the U.S., where apparently there's also some talk of putting out a more severe travel advisory, we might see the same thing happen.
Yeah, and obviously there's some very careful language being used in all of this, but I thought it was noteworthy that the minister did say, well, Canadians should keep looking at our website. Yeah. Certainly she's not closing the door to changing this status. Really, yeah, a remarkable set of circumstances. Anything else you want to add, Evan?
There's an awful lot of Canadians in China. An awful lot of Canadians do business in China. You have to think, looking back, the Chinese, there's 2 things going on in China, I think, that are both important. The government is angry, but also the people are angry. And we've heard talk from Canadian officials in the technical briefing about the appeals to the government of Canada to keep a lid on that situation. They talk about threats on social media and emails that the embassy has been receiving. And there's precedent for this. If you remember when the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was destroyed during the Yugoslav war, the Chinese government allowed very violent protests for days targeting the U.S. embassy. It was surrounded by tens of thousands of people throwing rocks. And the Chinese government, which of course can prevent protests the moment it wants to, let that happen. And it talked about the righteous patriotic anger of the people. We're in a similar situation here where the Chinese government is using and encouraging the feelings of anger and nationalism among its own people. And that could be a potentially very dangerous situation for any Canadian in China, including diplomats.
Okay. The CBC's Evan Dyer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, let's get some more reaction on this story. Now, Gordon Holden is a former Canadian diplomat to China. He's now the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Professor Holden joins me now from Seoul, South Korea, via FaceTime. So thank you. Minister Freeland just finished her press conference. China has confirmed that they have detained Michael Kovrig, but his whereabouts remain uncertain, as does the reason for his detention. I wonder, just writ large at this moment, what stands out for you about this case?
Well, I think that the arrest is not completely unexpected. When you have a case that's risen to the attention of the most senior levels of government, including probably the president, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China is not the number one player. If this Michael's been swept up by the Ministry of State Security. It also indicates that the gloves have come off. I doubt that the Chinese will do us the courtesy of formally linking the case. They won't tell us that it's indeed in response to the Hmong detention, but I think we can be pretty confident that's exactly what it is. The lack of consular detention so far is also worrisome, as is the prospect that it'd be a second individual. This is all on the bad news side, but ironically, I think it makes it tougher for the government to not proceed with the judicial process in Canada. We can't be seen to be backing down in the face of the seizure of Canadians abroad.
With the case of that second individual, obviously there are a lot of details we do not have at this point. It is not entirely clear based on what the minister is saying that what's happened with this individual. But would it be surprising to you at this stage of the game to hear that a second Canadian had in fact been detained as part of this broader process?
It would surprise me to some extent. I would have thought, just guessing, based on their past behavior, that China would, with one individual already in detention, they'd wait to see how that played out and what was the Canadian reaction. There are tens of thousands of Canadian citizens in China at any given time. Why the rush? So I get you're quite right. We need to wait and see who is the person, whether indeed they have been detained. China is a fairly cautious player in these things. They take deliberate steps. I don't think normally that they'd wish to do something rash. It's possible they have a second individual, but let's wait and see.
In terms of the safety of Canadians in China, I wonder what you think of the government's move thus far not to change its travel advisory to China.
They are in a difficult place. If they move quickly to a don't go to China, postpone non-essential travel, or postpone all travel, that will be seen as by the Chinese as an escalation, and the Chinese may well provide the same consular advice to their own citizens, and the vast numbers going in each direction at any given time. If they don't raise the risk level, and another Canadian or two is taken into detention, then they're open to criticism in that regard, and the practical problem they have will be multiplied. I think they've probably got it about right for now. Watch very carefully and wait and see. This is not East Timor. There's a vast number of people and a vast amount of business and business people going back and forth at all times. Raising that consular level is a big next step. And I think being a little bit cautious about the timing is a good thing.
Well, and to some extent that really is about diplomacy, but I wonder, would you personally be comfortable going to China right now?
Well, I would still go. Yeah. But I will confess a family member said they didn't think I should. I would, just on the basis of averages and chances. And I've never lived my life without taking any risks. I'm not about to start avoiding all risks. But I would certainly calculate it. And I think the minister's quite right. Take a careful look at that consular page and make sure it's current before you finalize your travel.
I do want to ask you about some of the information we're getting from Chinese state media about the situation of Michael Kovrig. They describe him as he's being questioned on suspicion of engaging in activities that harmed China's national security. When you hear that kind of language, what do you make of it?
I really don't like that language, particularly given if he has indeed been detained by Ministry of State Security. These is basically the state espionage and counter-espionage agency. It's powerful, reports the highest level of government. That kind of language might well be followed by a more formal detention or on the basis of espionage, which can be very broadly defined in China. No doubt he was in the information collection business, as in analysis, which is a pretty benign thing. A lot of journalists are doing exactly the same thing. But it's worrisome as a statement. But again, this is, in my view, a political detention. It would not have occurred without the Hmong detention. So the fact that it's occurred is just part of the Chinese game plan, a tit for tat in their view. In our view as Canadians, a completely different situation. One, someone detained under an extradition request for alleged violation of U.S. law. The other, a person picked up simply because it's a way of getting back, of retaliating.
Well, let's talk about how the comments by U.S. President Donald Trump might complicate that further. He told Reuters that he would intervene in Ms. Hmong's case if it would help secure a trade deal with Beijing. What do you think that does to this whole situation, and the situation Canada is in particular, as Canadians try to insist that this is not a political process?
I think the president, not for the first time, of course, really put the cat amongst the pigeons. If the detentions, in my view, make it more difficult for Canada not to proceed, we can't be seen to be caving in to blackmail, in effect, or having our citizens held as hostages. President Trump has pushed in the other direction. Indeed, the view of the government has been and is that the extradition treaty is there as part of the rule of law. It works in our benefit as well when it's getting Canadians who've been charged back into Canada to face justice. But when the president hints at this is just part of a deal-making process where he could lift the charges, quash the extradition request as part of a broad trade deal, that's precisely the wrong signal for Canada. And I suspect, in fact, I've already seen some reaction from U.S. political players, Senate, and officials who are testifying that U.S. does not operate in this fashion. Well, they've now been contradicted by their commander-in-chief, by their president. I think this is problematic. We'll see if that's sustained. President Trump, it seems, shoots from the hip a lot. But if that's a sustained U.S. position, I think that does change the calculation in Ottawa somewhat.
Well, and we did hear from Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, essentially a plea from extradition partners not to politicize the process, so it will certainly be something to watch. Thank you very much for your time. Gordon Holden.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Catherine.